So welcome and thank you for attending our webinar today, Digitization for Accessibility, Creating Fillable Forms in Adobe Acrobat and Other Useful Tools. This webinar has been funded by the Digital Literacy Exchange Project under the federal government and brought to you by Community Tech Connect and Literacy Link South Central. So thank you for attending again. My name is John Oviedo and I will be your host. We are recording this webinar so that we can continue to share literacy material for programs across Canada in the future. We are joined today by members of the Community Connect team, Literacy Link South Central, CNIB, Fanshawe College, as well as facilitators, educators, and Job Connection program participants. This webinar is presented by Literacy Link South Central and the JCP or Job Creation Program. Both myself and our Adobe expert Cass Behrens are presently digital education assistants in the Job Creation Program with Literacy Link South Central. So what makes us qualified to be directing this webinar? Well, my background is diverse and I'm a lifelong learner. I have spent years in either management roles or immersed in creative endeavors. I'm a certified interior decorator, photographer, and I love sharing knowledge and resources. So I have become recently passionate about accessibility and inclusion as it pertains to universal design for learning. I'll finish by also saying that Adobe is a new thing for me. I understand now how versatile and useful it is as a program, even though I do usually prefer to use free software. I was regularly frustrated with the free software, so I can't do everything that I always hope that it'll do. So this program will make your life easier and is valuable in today's world online for digital learners and facilitators. Your teacher today, Cass Behrens, has a background in IT and has earned the title of Adobe expert as well as being one of our troubleshooting wizards within the team. Many of the projects she is working on right now specifically pertain to accessibility auditing and UDL checkpoints. She has facilitated the team's accessible document training over the last 5 months and is passionate about sharing what she knows. And I can say that she has been a fantastic help in my learning process. So as we go through our agenda here, the main focus today will be a brief presentation on Accessibility Checker in Word. And then we will move into Adobe Acrobat Pro DC to overview some of the most useful tools in general and creating fillable forms. This program has a monthly or yearly subscription fee. The link on your screen will bring you to some pricing comparisons and also is noted in your handouts. The free version of Adobe is very limited and will not work for creating fillable PDFs. However, with both Adobe Acrobat Pro DC's versatility and accessibility features, we believe the software is worth the investment. So you can move licenses from person to person with this program through the admin. You can buy however many units you like. You can use the license on several devices through email. So it's very portable. Also something to note that for smaller nonprofit organizations, there are opportunities that exist for discounts through TechSoup. So I have that link posted on your screen. And again, it also will be in your handouts, and everything that we go through today, you will have a copy of for further learning and reference. The three main takeaways today will be, first, to be interested in the practicality and versatility of Adobe. Second, we really want you to be confident through easy to follow hands-on demonstrations and believe that the experience of this program will make everything easier. The third is to be motivated. So to create accessible Adobe documents with our support materials moving forward. Our handouts have step-by-step tools, tips, and links for further learning, as well as everything we cover here today. We will have some question periods. So we'll break partial way through the webinar itself. And then at the end of the webinar, we will have a question period as well. So if you come up with any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the chat. Myself and Jeremy today will be monitoring that, and then we'll get to those at those breaks throughout the webinar. Again, you will have a handout package. So for the webinar next week, I'll just throw this in there. For the webinar next week, we're going to send those out beforehand. But for the purpose of today, I'll just mention them. So let's get started. It is my pleasure now to introduce Kaz Behrens.
Hello. My name is Cassandra Behrens, but I go pretty exclusively by Cass. Thank you for being here. I am very excited to have the chance to share my knowledge with you all. So without further ado, let's get into it. Generally, when creating an accessible document, an accessible form for your people, you want to start in Word and build a strong template because it saves a lot of time and is much easier. I've already done that here. And I've also set up some stuff that will help me later on. I've used decorative lines and boxes, which will actually help me when I move over to Adobe. The last step, which is the one step I still need to do, is to run your accessibility checker in Word. As once again, this can save you a lot of grief down the road. So we're just going to run, click check accessibility, and all of my document is accessible. So at this point, I would just click create and share Adobe PDF. And it pops up right in Adobe just like this. First thing we're going to want to do when we're in Adobe is we're going to want to make sure all of the tools we're going to use are set up. And we can do that by going over here into this ribbon and clicking more tools. From there, we're going to add prepare form and accessibility. But there are a lot of tools here that I would encourage people to explore. Now that our tools are set up, I'm going to put a few final adjustments on this document. I'm going to add an image that would have been very difficult to place in Word, but is very easy to add here in Adobe. Resize it. Position it how I want and stuff. And I'm also going to move this line down a little bit. Or not. I've actually already gone through and prepared this form, so I'd like to walk you through how I prepared this form further. However, first, when it comes time to start preparing your form fields, you need to click Prepare Form, and you'll see this screen. This screen is just making sure that this is the document you want to do this to, because once you click it, you're kind of stuck working with what happens. There's no real undo for it. You'll notice it says Form Field Auto Detection is on. This means that Adobe will try to figure out where I want my form fields and what form fields I want to a degree. You can turn it off, but I find it actually saves a lot of time to leave it on. So long as I'm willing to go through and verify that the form fields it's put there are the ones I want. So it'll ask me to save, and then it'll transfer over. Generally speaking, it will assume that anytime you use a rectangle, an empty rectangle, or a line, that you want a text field. And if you use a square, generally a small square, it'll usually guess that you want a checkbox. Now, I've already gone ahead and prepared some of this to just go through and review. So we're going to switch over to the one that I have prepared. The first thing I'm going to do over here is I'm going to actually verify that all the pages I want are here over in this panel. And I'm also going to double check my bookmarks to make sure that there isn't any bookmarks that shouldn't be there, or any bookmarks that should and aren't. In this case, I've got a few blank pages. I just delete them. Then the first type of text field I tend to use is generally the first type of field I tend to use is generally a text field. Now, to modify fields, I need to make sure that this tool here is selected, because this tool will modify the PDF itself. A lot like the Edit PDF tool, but to a lesser extent. But since I want to work with form fields, this is the tool I need. Now, when setting these up, it's very important that you give each field a name, which if you use auto-generate, it'll probably put the text right before it as its name, and an effective tooltip. All your fields need to have tooltips, because this is what the screen reader will read when it comes to the form field. They can be very simple. It's good just to have instructions as to what kind of input the field needs. So in this case, enter name of who this check is for. You can also mark fields as required, and then highlight them in a bright red box, which can add some extra emphasis, draw some more attention to the fields you really need filled out. For bigger fields, you're going to want to make sure you go in and have in your options multi-line selected, because otherwise the input in the fields could wind up being just one long string of text, never ending basically. Multi-line will actually, once it gets to the edge of the field, it'll continue on the next line. And if you intend to print your form, it is very good to set a character limit on the field so that people do not overfill the field. While you're in here, it's also very good to verify that your font size is good. 12 is the minimal size for accessibility. If you drop below 12, you're not accessible. And that you have a sans serif font, which Helvetica is. You can also go in and format your fields to control what type of input people are putting in. In this case, I selected date and the format in which I wanted the date written. If someone writes the date in a way that I have not requested, it'll clear the field and a pop-up will appear telling them how I would like the date to be entered. So it can be very handy to format. You can also do custom validations for checking the input, but those are pretty complicated and can often be a little fussy. So they're very handy, but they're very time consuming to set up. Once your text fields are set up, And as a quick cheat, you can also select multiple fields of the same type to verify their settings a little bit. So to verify font setting and the checking of multi-line, I can actually select all my text fields at once. You're basically good to go. There's not really a lot more to them. They're very simple. The next type of field I want to talk about is the drop-down. Up here in our bar, we have all of our field types. For example, that was text field, and here's the drop-down. The drop-down is very easy to set up as well. Once again, you go into the properties and make sure you have your name and tooltip. And you generally check your font size. In this case, you also need to try to make sure your field is big enough to contain whatever text is the text for your options. But you go in to add your options here. And it's very simple. You just type them and you click add, and they'll appear on the list. An important note is to make sure that whatever you want the default option to be is the one you select before you move forward. There's more you can do with these, but that's the gist of setting them up. And they're pretty good for limiting the number of options a person can pick. Alternatively, we also have list boxes, the option for which is right here. They're the same as drop downs, but they look a little bit different. But they work and their setup is pretty much the same. After that, the field I tend to use next most is called the checkbox when I'm creating these forms. Checkboxes are great for when you have a list of options. And it's okay for them to select more than one option. So in this case, I can check as many of these reasons as I want. Their setup is, once again, quite simple. The hardest part of their setup usually being getting them into alignment. You go in, you put in your tooltip and your name, your appearance, and you can also change the style of it to make it look different. But generally, the hardest part is aligning them. So for that, these buttons over here are your best friend. Adobe will use these alignments to match sizes and to do align button things together. And it will always choose, and when you're selecting, it will always choose the first from the left to right, top to bottom. So if I select all these, it chose not my size. So it was the first on the left and the highest. In this case, I'll select these two and click that, and these two and click that. Using these buttons, you really only have to lay up the first one in the row. And once that first one is laid up, or column and then row, once that first one is laid up, the rest of them will all snap into order. It's a huge time saver. Now, let's say that you have a list of options, but you really only want them to be able to choose one. In that case, you would use what's called a radio button. Radio buttons are this option right here on the bar. And their setup is a little bit different from any of the fields we've done so far because they're set up in groups. That's how Adobe enforces that people are only selecting one. So when you pick one, it'll pop down you'll give the button a name and the group a name. So doesn't really matter. And you can mark it as required. But then it says you have to add another button because a group cannot be less than 2. In your next button, the group name will be there and you just have to name the button, the individual button. Now, I cannot stress how important it is, though, that you make sure the button's name actually reflects the option. So if you look over here, in this group, that button is, what the heck just happened? Okay. That button says that person. Now, the reason it's very important to have these button names be very clear is in addition to all the buttons sharing a group name, all the buttons also share a tooltip. So these are not as accessible to screen readers as checkboxes. But otherwise, they're very simple to set up. And as I just tried to do a minute ago, you can go in and you can change their appearance if you want them to look more consistent with checkboxes. I can make them all appear as checkboxes. And again, those alignment buttons, very big time savers. Next, let's talk about button buttons. This is the option for buttons right here. And you really just take them and you pick them up. But a difference between these and the other fields we've talked about so far is all of the setup is done in properties. I can easily make my buttons do a lot of stuff, but the first and most important things you got to do is get it set up. So you want your name and appropriate tooltip. Your appearance is even more important in this one. Generally, you're going to want to have, probably not want it to be a gray square. So you would choose your colors. You can give it a border outline if you need to make it pop, and your font color. And then it's very important you come in here and you over here and you label it. You can also, if you like, add an image to the button. They call it an icon. Now, a small quick side note is that buttons don't tend to print when you print your form. So you don't actually have to worry about keeping them out of, like within the print margins. You can place them wherever you feel is best because they don't print. But that's what it now looks like instead of just being a gray square. Next, to set up your button, you need to give it its action. Now you can change the button's behavior a fair bit, but I wouldn't suggest doing this. You can also change how the button is triggered, but I would generally suggest sticking with mouse up because it means click. If you try to get too creative with the button behaviors, they can become much less functional. And then from there, once you have your trigger and all that other stuff set up, you get to select an option of what you would like the button to do. And you get to select from this list, or you can select from this list. Or if you're really interested, if you're really keen on it, you can even have the button run a custom JavaScript. So you can write and run a custom JavaScript. which basically means that the uses of buttons, like how useful buttons are, is more or less limited to how much you want to put into them, how much setup you want to do, because they can do a lot. In this case, I have 2 buttons set up. One of them will reset form and clear the fields if I'm in fill form. Clearing that check mark. And the other will automatically launch the print options to print the form. But there's a lot more you can do with them. You can have them play sounds, you can have them link out, you can have them navigate through the form. Like, there's a lot you can do. They're very versatile. At this point, I would ask if anybody has any questions. And note that I actually forgot to stop at the previous question period.
Cass, we do
Okay.
have a couple of questions. Dawn,
Okay.
if you'd like to be the one to bring those forward, go right ahead.
Okay, so we do have a question from Anne Marie. So a couple of questions, actually. I did run through some items with her, but I want to bring them to your attention. So one of the questions was, is starting the form in Word a must? What if someone sent me a PDF and I wanted to digitize that?
Okay, well, you do not have to start the form in Word. You really don't, but it is a lot easier. It will save you a lot of time and grief to start it in Word. Even if they've sent you a PDF, it's often worthwhile to bring it back, bring the information in that PDF back into Word, because it's easier. If you don't start in Word, you have to do a lot more with the accessibility checker and a lot more with tagging. And that's a whole nother thing that we could do a whole webinar just on that. So it is actually a lot easier to start Word, but you do not have to.
Okay, and then the second part of that was, what if someone sent me a PDF and I want to digitize that?
Well, if you have the Pro DC, even if they sent you a scan of a form, which that's a very good, I should really test that. I could do that with a scan. Sorry, you gave me an idea. But anyways, Adobe can convert it into text, and Adobe should even be able to import it back into Word. I will try to make sure that's included in the handouts. But the Pro DC can actually do a lot. And it can take this form and turn it, if any form you have can be turned into a digital form with this. You don't need to start in Word. Okay. Anne Marie, you got your hand up?
Good catch. I was just checking to see if anybody's watching. So yeah, I think about things like on the Government of Canada's website, they've got these fantastic self-assessments in PDFs, but they are not interactive. So that would be an example that I could use to tell you sort of where I'm thinking about that.
Oh yeah, and you could definitely do that. You can import them as long as they're not protected. You can import them in here and you can make them just flat out make them fillable. But if you want the accessibility, you're either going to be spending a lot more time in the next tool, in the accessibility tool, or you're going to want to go back into Word, because a lot of the time, a lot of PDFs that you're going to receive are not going to be terribly accessible. So it could wind up being more of a headache to not bring it back into Word. But you don't have to. You can absolutely, you can even create one from scratch here in Adobe if you want. Like Adobe does have all these options.
Okay, do we have any other questions? We can do one more and then we'll do another period at the end of the webinar.
Actually, I just quickly, thank you, Anne-Marie. That's a very good question. And I think I'm going to make sure I have a better structured answer, because I do know the answer. That's a very good question.
I can send you an example of what I'm talking about too. It's actually got like it's the self-assessment on different essential skills, and then at the bottom it's got 3 things I'd like to work on, 3 things I do well, and it's got lines for people to write on and stuff. So I thought those kinds of things would be fantastic if they were interactive. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
They would, and it is very possible. It's just would take a little more than we're going to cover in the intro.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's totally a curiosity, and it could be something that somebody else would ask too, because they may have forms that are in PDF that they got from they can't remember where, and can't go back and ask for the Word portion of it. So
Yeah.
curiosity about how do you take something that's in a PDF and make it interactive.
I can definitely, I'll have an answer written out. And I'll also try to make sure we touch on that in the handouts as well, and a little more in depth. But Adobe can, that's a great question, and Adobe definitely can do that. Sorry, is there any other questions?
So I don't see any other questions, so we can continue on.
Okay. So the next type of input fields I want to talk about is called an image field. An image field it's right here on the options, and it actually comes pretty much already set up when you pick it up and put it in. And what it allows people to do is it allows people filling out your forms to import pictures into the form, which can be super helpful if you want them to input a graph or take a photo or something for an assignment. They can be very useful. But an important note about these is that image fields work best in PDF readers. Every other field we've shown you up until this point should work very well within a browser, but an image field, it really likes the readers. It's not reliable in browser when using it with browsers. But you basically go in there, you name it, tooltip it. You might want to put a bit of a background color or a border color to try to help emphasize where the field is. And you might want to include some instructions as to what the field wants you to do, even for the people who are not using screen readers, even if the instruction is just click. But for the most part, these will already come very set up, as you can see when you go here. The code is already in them. One final important note about these, though, is that you're not going to generally be able to download the image from them. Once the image is in them, it's either staying there or cleared. You can always use your snipping tool to take a little shot of it, but you can't really download the image from it so far. And the last type of field I wanted to talk about before we finish talking about form fields is the signature field. It's this option right here on the bar. And they're once again very easy to set up, mostly just requiring a name and a tooltip. But a very, very important note about these is this field type does not work outside of Adobe or paid PDF readers. Adobe products are paid PDF readers. It's a security feature to keep the digital signature that they can input safe, because they can actually use their mouse or their trackpad to sign with this. Or I think it's even possible for them to take a photo of their signature and upload it into Adobe. And Adobe will store it encrypted. And just about any paid PDF reader should be able to do that. But it is limited to that for security reasons. One final quick note about form fields before I move on to the accessibility portion is that if you're hosting your forms on the Google Drive with Google Docs, for people to reliably be able to fill out your forms, they do need to download them from the Google Docs. Although any browser can modify PDFs, Google Docs does not like form fields from Adobe. So some of the form fields, like checkboxes, don't work. I think text fields do and checkboxes won't. But it's always the best bet to have them download it, and they can always re-upload it to Google Drive to submit it, or email it, or however you need it submitted. And it won't lose anything they've entered in it, but it might not let them enter all the fields if you don't download it. Now moving on to the accessibility tool. Now, when you get into the accessibility of the form, your best friend is going to be this accessibility checker. Check right here. You just click it and you have it run a full check. And it'll pop up with any problems that might exist within the form. For example, I haven't given this form a title. Now, in this case, whenever you right-click on these errors, it will give you some options on how to deal with the errors, including an explanation that will launch one of Adobe's little explanation tutorials in Microsoft Edge. If you're very lucky, occasionally you get it where it will actually say fix. And in those cases, you just click. And it'll lead you exactly where you need to go. And it passed. If you see a question mark, this is actually not necessarily an error, but rather something that Adobe cannot verify. It needs you, the user, to manually verify that these things are good. So in my case, I've mostly gone through the logical the reading order before this. So I'm going to pass that because I've already checked it. But every time I run the checker, it'll once again ask me to double check these things. Now, occasionally you'll also get errors that are sort of repeats. So you should start with, you just start working through them. It's very simple. First, how do we find the error? We know that there's an error here. How we find it is we go and we click. And then in this particular case, it's telling me, I could have it explained, but I already know it's telling me in this case that this form field is not going to be recognized by screen readers. Screen readers are just going to pass over it because it's not included, it's not tagged in the reading order. So to quickly tag it, it's very easy. I just go into reading order, I select it, and then I click form field. This is the reading order panel here. And it'll now appear in the reading order. And when I go back to my checker, it's cleared it. Now it's also complaining about this one. It's now tagged in the reading order as well, which will clear the whole error, which clears all the errors there. But it's very, Adobe really helps you through the process a lot. In this case, it says field description and it's highlighted this field. And what it means in this case is simply that I forgot my tooltip. I check again, it clears. It's very easy and very helpful this way. I find it's usually best to start by fixing errors like the tagged form field and the field descriptions and alt text things, because often it clears a lot of other errors before you even have to deal with them. A good example would be this error right here. I imported this into the document, but it actually doesn't have an alt text, which means screen reader, and it's not even tagged in the reading order. So screen readers cannot read it, cannot do anything with it. So what I do is I double click it. And generally you have to drag to select things when you're in the reading order panel. But when it comes to images, you can actually just double click. And then I click figure. I right click, edit alternate text. And then I click OK. And with that, I've actually had something I'm going to have to double check before the webinar. A bunch of errors should have cleared there. I think I know what happened. But for the most part, it's fairly simple. I would suggest, though, that when you're fixing things, especially with reading order, that if the reading order is close, you generally just leave it alone, because this is actually fairly tricky. Should you venture in there, just be sure you save every time something works, because when you're in the accessibility tool and working with all this stuff, there is no undo button. So just save frequently, because then if anything goes wrong, you can bounce back. And with that, our introduction to Adobe is pretty much complete.